Good afternoon, students. Today we are going to discuss the next topic in the unit, some administrative problems in secondary education. Today's topic that we are going to discuss has been written in the board. Please write it down. It is rationale for public investment in education. That means, why should we pay for secondary education? Now there has been four important dimensions in the investment of public money in education. Those four dimensions are: so these are the four important dimensions of financing of education. First one is intersectoral allocation. That means public money is distributed among several sectors of a country for its holistic development. Education is one such sector. In case of intrasectoral allocation, we know that the allocation of fund in education is divided into several categories, as for example, allocation for elementary education, allocation for upper primary education, allocation for secondary and higher secondary education, and also allocation for higher education. So there are specific categories of allocation within the sector education itself. So we call it intra-sectoral allocation. Now, what is interfunctional allocation? This interfunctional allocation means allocation of fund for different activities as teaching, administration, student welfare, etc. And the last one is quite simple, that allocation of fund from public fund from center to state and state to local bodies, etc. So what is public fund? Public fund is a fund that is gained by the governments from the taxpayers' money. Now, hope you have written these things. Now, how to examine the public investment in education? Now, intersectoral allocation of resource can be examined by looking at couple of important indicators. There are two important indicators to examine the intersectoral allocation for education. What are those indicators? Those indicators are share of educational expenditure, in total income, and again that's same share of educational expenditure in total revenue expenditure. Now, how to examine intrasectoral allocation of public fund for expansion of education? That can be judged by the trends in educational budget. Every year or every alternate years, whenever educational budget is passed by the central government as well as state government, if we follow the trend, the allocation of fund in different stratum of education, we can easily examine the trend. That means how much budget is allocated for elementary education, what is the proportion of budget allocated for secondary education, higher education, etc. The total expenditure, planned and non-planned, and also the grant in aid for secondary education, elementary education, higher education, etc. All these things help us to examine the intrasectoral allocation of fund for education. Now, what is the trend for the past few years? So for the past few years, it has been seen from the trend of intrasectoral allocation that the allocation for secondary education has remained stagnant. It has been noted also that real public expenditure in secondary education used to be higher earlier, but now not only it has become less, but also for the past few years it has remained stagnant. But if we perceive the nature of the global market right now and to export our educated youth to the global market as the future citizens of 21st century, we need to develop secondary education more and more, and that can only be achieved through higher investment of public money in secondary education. Now the fundamental portion of today's topic. Why should we invest for secondary education. That means why there should be public financing in secondary education. So, public financing should be there in secondary education, as secondary education is a public good as well as it is a merit good. Now the question comes, what are the characteristics of a public good? Now, to be a pure public good, a good has to have two fundamental characteristics. Those are non-rivalry and non-excludability. Now, what does it mean? Non-rivalry means when a good is consumed, it does not reduce the amount available for others. I repeat, non-rivalry of a good means signifies that when a good is consumed, it does not reduce the amount available for consumption to others. Now, what is non-excludability? Non-excludability occurs when it is not possible to provide a good without it being available to others for their enjoyment also. So we cannot exclude a good, we cannot earmark a good for a specific group of people, for a specific individual. That is non-excludability. Now, what is a merit good? Merit good is defined as a good which is preferred by the whole community for its enjoyment and for the societal benefit of the whole community. When a good is considered for the societal benefit of a community as a whole, it is referred as a merit good. Now, is education a merit good as well as a public good? Obviously, because the wide variety and huge magnitude of externalities to education. There are so many players in the educational sectors that it is definitely a public good. As well as we cannot divide the benefits of education into specific groups of individuals or a sector like that. So, education is obviously a public good as well as a merit good. Now, for quite a long time, elementary education has been considered as a pure public good. And what's it about higher education? In the other end, it is considered as a quasi public good. And what is about secondary education? Secondary education has been considered as to have the ambivalent nature. That means it is a pure public good as well as a quasi public good. Why is it so? Now, as we admit that education is a public good, secondary education is a pure public good as well as a merit good, then it may be the right of the citizens to get public investment in secondary education, and also it may be considered as a contract between a nation and its citizens. Secondary education can be considered as a right as well as it may be a contract between a nation and its citizens. So, if we consider that secondary education is a right and as well as a contract between the nation and its citizens, public investment in secondary education obviously becomes necessary, because in a developing country like India, where there is poverty, where there is inequality, where there is injustice in certain cases, when there is market imperfections, then these problems can be solved only by a better secondary education. And that better education, secondary education, can be achieved only through increasing public investment more and more. Now, these public investment, greater public investment in secondary education will help the youth to get proper education, better education, and that will also equip them to get a better job in the 21st century global market. And obviously, with this employment, the social inequality that exists even today in India, will be decreased to certain extent, which will be highly commendable. And second round of gain also can be achieved through this public investment in secondary education. How? Because as employment will increase, that will increase in turn the tax return, and obviously distribution of wealth, more and more even distribution of wealth among the citizens of India. So with this, we conclude today's discussion on the rationale of public investment in education. Thank you.